Hey guys, I'm Dr. Gonzalez, and today in this video we're going to talk about the following topics. But before we get started, don't forget to subscribe.
Let's talk about tissues. So your tissues are a group of specialized cells that need to come together in order to work and perform a specific function. So your cells have to combine to form tissues. And the study or science of tissues, it's called histology. So based on this, we can classify these tissues into 4 primary tissue types. The first one is the epithelial, second one is the connective, third one is muscular, and fourth, nervous tissue. And as we study these tissues, you have to think of how deep these tissues are versus how superficial they can be in relationship to the human body. So for example, the epithelial tissues are going to be the most superficial ones. Then it's going to be followed by the connective tissue. Then you're going to see muscular tissue, and of course bones. And then, which is bones are actually part of connective tissue, by the way. And then the deepest tissue that you have in this case would be considered nervous tissue, even though nervous tissue can also reach out towards the epithelial tissues. Now let's describe these 4 types of tissue. The first one is the epithelial tissue. The epithelial tissue covers the body surface and lines hollow organs, body cavities, and ducts. The second one is the connective tissue, which protects and supports the body. It also binds, stores energy, and provides immunity. The third one is the muscular tissue for contraction and force. And it also generates heat. For this one, we're going to have 3 types of muscular tissue. And the last one is the nervous tissue, which detects the changes inside and outside of the body. And it generates electrical signals. So this is what I call, it's the boss of your body. And it's made up of 2 types of cells. We have neurons and neuroglia. For purposes of disclosure, I'm going to be using an app called Visible Body AMP. So these pictures and images that you're seeing, they belong to Visible Body AMP. All right, so because of the amount of tissues that we have, I'm just going to go ahead and start with the nervous tissue, which is only I'm just going to show you 2 types of cells in here. The first one is a neuron, right, which is what you're seeing on the screen. And neurons transmit electrical impulses by using this structure that we have right here. It's called the axon. They also have these dendrites, and they have a body called the soma. So most neurons have a cell body, dendrites, and axons, and they carry sensory and motor information and perform integrative functions. The second type of cell of the nervous tissue, it's the neuroglia. They are usually supporting cells for the neurons. And the neuroglia, what they do is that they protect and support neurons. So here on Visible Body, you can see some examples of neuroglia, like these microglia, ependymal cells, oligodendrocytes, and astrocytes. And if you move forward, you can see an actual tissue under magnification. Right here, you can see astrocytes, you can see oligodendrocytes, microglia, and ependymal cells. But there's also Schwann cells as well. Now let's talk about muscle tissue. These muscles are cells that are capable of contraction, and they have a very specialized type of organelles. For example, they will have sarcoplasm, which is the cytoplasm of a muscle, and they have a sarcolemma, which is the plasma membrane, for example. So muscle tissues consist of fibers that provide motion, they maintain posture, and they produce heat. And they also have proteins that make up these cells, called actin thin filaments and myosin thick filaments. And we can divide them into 3 types of muscle tissue. The first one you can see here, it's the cardiac muscle in this list. So cardiac muscle, it's an involuntary type of muscle, meaning that you do not control it. It's striated, meaning that you can see these branch intercalated discs and gap junctions. If we take a closer look at this tissue, you can see them right here and right here, for example. And there's no regeneration typically, right? The second type of muscle you see here is the skeletal muscle cell. This muscle is striated and voluntary. Voluntary meaning that you can control it when you think of moving. And striated because you can see how organized this muscle is. You see the striations. You see the branches in this case, and you can see how multinucleated it is. So you see many nuclei in these fibers, and you see the striations. And the third one is the smooth muscle. It is involuntary, meaning that you do not control it, and it has no striations. So for example, the smooth muscle is found in blood vessels and in the GI tract.
Now it's time for a short discussion break.
Now let's talk about the most superficial types of tissues, which is the epithelium. So epithelia are based off sheets of cells that cover every exposed body surface, and they line any internal cavities and pathways, like internal glands, for example, your skin, your oral cavity, etc. So some of the general features of the epithelial tissue is that these cells are arranged in sheets. These cells are densely packed. They have many cell junctions. These epithelial cells also attach to a basement membrane, and epithelial tissues, it's typically an avascular tissue, but it does have nerve supply. And I say typically because there might be some areas that could reach the vascularity, meaning blood vessels. And in this case, mitosis occurs frequently. So in this picture, you can see the different types of epithelial tissue, and you see how they are classified. For example, in this case, we can classify them as simple or stratified, and we can classify them based on the cell shape. But before we get there, I just want to show you or tell you a couple of additional things. For example, we are going to have an apical surface, which means that these cells generally have a top portion, right, in every single one of them. So that's the apical free surface. And there's going to be a basement membrane, which is, it attaches the tissue to the adjacent floor, right, to the floor basically. All right, another thing is, like I was saying, how we classify these tissues. So for example, we can have the arrangements of layers, starting with the simple layer, right, which means it's just one layer of tissues. And we can have the stratified layer, which means that it's 2 or more layers in there. So if you count 2 or more, it's classified as stratified. There's also an additional arrangement of layer called the pseudo-stratified. Pseudo, and pseudo means false. So it tends to look like there is, let's say that there is more than one layer, but in reality it's just one layer, right? The second thing to classify epithelial tissues, like I said, is the cell shape, and that's gonna be based on if it's like a squamous type of tissue, like you can see here. This type of cell is squamous, which means that it's flat. There is the cuboidal, which means that it looks like a square, and there is a columnar, which looks like a column. And when we combine these two types of classification, we generate these types of tissue. For example, we have the simple squamous tissue, simple cuboidal, or simple columnar in the simple area, or the stratified, remember, is 2 or more. So we have stratified squamous, stratified cuboidal, and stratified columnar. And we always gonna name these layers based on the first layer. We're gonna name the tissues based on the first layer. The first layer is gonna give you the name. There is one additional tissue I did not mention. It's called the transitional tissue, because this one can change its shape from from squamous to cuboidal and vice versa. So from cuboidal to squamous. For example, in tissues like the human bladder, whenever the bladder is full or last but not least on this video, I want to talk about the connective tissue. So some of the general features of connective tissue is that it consists of two basic elements, cells and extracellular matrix. Also, it's widely abundant. The cells do not cover or line. They do not have any free surfaces, and it's highly vascularized, meaning that it has a lot of blood vessels and has a nerve supply, except for tendons and cartilages. Some of the features of connective tissue is going to be a bunch of cells like macrophages, fibroblasts, mast cells, and plasma cells. Also, eosinophils, neutrophils, and adipocytes, which is fat cells that store fat. And other things that you will find in the connective tissue, it's fibers like reticular fibers, collagen fiber, and elastic fibers. And in general, let's go ahead. I'm going to go ahead and name some of the tissues. We can classify it as embryonic or mature. And in embryonic, there's going to be the mesenchyme and mucus. And for mature, you're going to have, for example, the loose tissues, like this type of loose connective tissue that you see here. So for example, the areolar tissue, adipose, and reticular are classified as loose. In this one, you can see areolar tissue in the papillary dermis. Also, there's the dense, like the dense regular, dense irregular, and elastic. So here's an example of the dense. And for cartilage, there's the hyaline cartilage, fibrocartilage, and elastic cartilage. Here's an example of the cartilage, right? In this case, you're seeing the hyaline cartilage. And in terms of additional connective tissue, we have, for example, bone and liquid connective tissue such as blood and lymph. So here you can see an example on blood.
Well, that's it for this video. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share. And if you have any comments for me, you can leave them on the comment section below.